Wow. Okay, maybe it was a decent day. I don't know. Feeling okay. That's alright. I actually I tried to stream. Yeah. There's one thing more I can. In my daughter's room, we're setting up computers in there, and really need a memory upgrade. I've got a machine like this one in there, but the graphics are lower, and also it was on the wireless, and I think I've got a Cat 7 and I can go line 5G to that thing, right? So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that today when I was playing, I couldn't stream at the same time. I tried to start a stream and it was just like it's too much for the thing to handle. I don't know if it was the wireless or the machine itself. I'm not sure. But got a good 23% into the American occupation of the Philippines by Blount. And that's what we want to continue with here. I'd like to have some music. Sure would. How about this one? We'll see how this goes.
And in their personal and religious rights, all persons who either by active aid or by honest submission cooperate with the government of the United States to give effect to these beneficent purposes will receive the reward of its support and protection. All others will be brought within the lawful rule we have assumed, with firmness, if need be, but without severity, so far as possible, within the absolute domain of military authority, which necessarily isn't, must remain supreme in the ceded territory until the legislation of the United States shall otherwise provide the municipal laws of the territory. In respect to private rights and property and the repression of crime are to be considered as continuing in force, and to be administered by the ordinary tribunals. So far as practicable, the operations of civil and municipal government are to be performed by such officers as may accept the supremacy of the United States by taking the oath of allegiance, or by officers chosen, as far as practicable, from the inhabitants of the land, while the control of all public property and the revenues of the state passes the possession, and while the use and management of all public means of transportation are necessarily reserved to the authority of the United States. Private property, whether belonging to individuals or corporations, is to be respected except for cause duly established. The taxes and duties heretofore payable by the inhabitants to the right government become payable to the authorities of the United States, unless it be seen fit to substitute for them other reasonable rates or modes of contribution to the expenses of government, whether general or local. If private property be taken for military use, it shall be paid for when possible in cash, at a fair valuation. And when payment in cash is not practicable, receipts are to be given. All ports and places in the Philippine Islands in the actual possession of the land and naval forces of the United States will be open to the commerce of all friendly nations. All goods and wares not prohibited for military reasons by due announcement of the military authority will be admitted upon payment of such duties and other charges as shall be in force at the time of their importation. Finally, it should be the earnest wish and paramount aim of the military administration to win the confidence, respect, and affection of the inhabitants of the Philippines by assuring them in every possible way that full measure of individual rights and liberties which is the heritage of free peoples, and by proving to them that the mission of the United States is one of benevolent assimilation, substituting the mild sway of justice and right for arbitrary rule. In the fulfillment of this high mission, supporting the temperate administration of affairs for the greatest good of the governed, there must be sedulously maintained a strong arm of authority to repress disturbance and to overcome all obstacles to the bestowal of the blessings of good and stable government upon the people of the Philippine Islands under the free flag of the United States. William McKinley. The words used in the foregoing proclamation, which were regarded by the Filipinos as fighting words, i.e. is making certain the long anticipated probability of a war for independence, are those which appear in italics. The rest of the proclamation counted for nothing. With them, they had been used to the hollow rhetoric and flowery promises of equally eloquent Spanish proclamations all their lives. They and their fathers were building in suing to President McKinley for peace on July 22, previous. The Prime Minister of Spain had justified all the atrocities committed and permitted by his government in Cuba during the 30 years struggle for independence through which preceded the Spanish-American War by saying that what Spain had done had been prompted only by a desire to spare the great island from the dangers of premature independence. 158. Clearly, from the Filipino point of view, the United States was now determined to spare them from the dangers of premature independence. Using such forces might be necessary for the accomplishment of that pious purpose. The truth is that, Prometheus-like, we stole the sacred fire from the altar of freedom whereupon the flames of the Spanish War were kindled, and gave it to the Filipinos, justifying the means by the end. And the links of the lean lemnian have been festering in our flesh ever since. The benevolent assimilation proclamation was a kind of Pandora box, supposed to contain all the blessings of liberty, but when the lid was taken off, woes innumerable befell the intended beneficiaries, and left them only the hope of freedom from us. Verily there is nothing new under the sun. It is written, Thou shalt not steal anything, not even sacred fire. There is no such thing as nimble morality. The lesson of the old Greek poet fits our case. So also, indeed, do those of the modern sage, Maeterlinck. For the Filipinos could have found their own bluebird for happiness. The record of our experience in the Philippines is full of reminders, which will multiply as the years go by, that, after all, every people have an unalienable right to pursue happiness in their own way as opposed to somebody else's way. That is the law of God, as God gives me to see the right conceived during the Christmas holiday season and in the spirit of that blessed season and presented to the Filipino people on New Year's Day, received by them practically as a declaration of war and baptized in the blood of thousands of them in the Battle of February 4th thereafter. The manner of the reception of this famous document, the initial reversal and subsequent evolution of its policies, and all the lights and shadows of benevolent assimilation will be traced in the chapters which follow. Chapter 9. The Iloilo Fiasco. The King of France with 40,000 men marched up the hill and then marched down again. Old English ballad. We have already seen how busily Aguinaldo occupied himself during the protracted peace negotiations at Paris in getting his government and people ready for the struggle for independence which he early and shrewdly guessed would be ultimately forthcoming. General Otis was in no position to preserve the status quo. The status quo was a worm in hot ashes that would not stay still. The revolution was a snowball that would roll the day after Christmas. General Otis at last sent an expedition under General Marcus P. Miller to the relief of Iloilo, but when it arrived, December 28th, the Spaniards had already turned the town over to the insurgent authorities and sailed away. When General Miller arrived, being under imperative orders from Washington to be conciliatory and under no circumstances to have a clash with the insurgents, the administration's most earnest solicitude being to avoid a clash, at least until the Treaty of Peace with Spain should be ratified by the United States Senate, he courteously asked permission to land several times, being refused each time. With a request of this sort sent ashore January 1, 1899, he transmitted a copy of the proclamation set forth. In the preceding chapter, the insurgent reply defiantly forbade him to land, therefore he did not land, because Washington was pulling the strings, until after the treaty was ratified. So here we are at Iloilo, an exploded bluff, wrote more correspondent J.F. Bates to his paper, Harper's Weekly. By the time the treaty was ratified, the Battle of Manila of February 4th had occurred, and the pusillanimity of self-doubting diplomacy had given way to the red honesty of war. 159. As was noticed in the chapter preceding this, by the end of December 1898, all military stations outside Luzon, with the exception of Zamboanga, in the extreme south of the great Mohammedan island of Mindanao near Borneo, had been turned over by the Spaniards to the insurgents. When General Miller, commanding the expedition to Iloilo, arrived in the harbor of that city with his teeming troop ships and naval escorts on December 28, an aide of the Filipino commanding general came aboard the boat he was on and desired to know, said General Miller's report. 160. If we had anything against them, were we going to interfere with them? General Miller then sent some of his own aides ashore with a letter to the insurgent authorities, explaining the peaceful nature of his errand. They at once asked if our people had brought down any instructions from Aguinaldo, answering in the negative. General Miller's aides handed them his olive branch letter. They read it and said they could do nothing without orders from Aguinaldo in cases affecting the federal government. The grim veteran commanding the American troops smoked on this for a day or so, and then asked a delegation of insurgents that were visiting his ship by his invitation, they would not let him land. You see, whether, if he landed, they would meet him with armed resistance. The melee, reverence for the relation of host and guest resulted in an evasive reply. They could not answer, but after they went back to the city, they did answer, and this is what they wrote. Upon the return of your commissioners last night, we discussed the situation and attitude of this region of Visayas in regard to its relations and dependence upon the central government of Luzon, the Aguinaldo government, of course. And I have the honor to notify you that, in conjunction with the people, the army, and the committee, we insist upon our pretension not to consent to any foreign interference without express orders from the central government of Luzon, with which we are one in ideas, as we have been until now in sacrifices. If you insist upon disembarking your forces, this is our final attitude. May God forgive you, etc. Iloilo, December 30th, 1898, 161. This letter is recited in General Miller's report to be from President Lopez of the federal government of Visayas. General Miller then wrote Otis begging permission to attack on the ground that upon the success of the expedition he was in charge of depends the future speedy yielding of insurrectionary movements in the islands. War correspondent Bass, who was on the ground at the time, also wrote his paper. The effect on the natives will be incalculable all over the islands. But General Otis was trying to help M.R. McKinley nurse the treaty through the Senate on the idea that there weren't going to be any insurrectionary movements in the islands, that all dark and misguided conspiracies of selfishly ambitious leaders looking to such impious ends would fade before the sunlight of benevolent assimilation. Cautioning Otis against any clash at Iloilo, M.R. McKinley wired January 9th conflict would be most unfortunate, considering the present time given the insurgents cannot injure us, and must weaken and discourage them, they will see our benevolent purpose, etc. 162. The Iloilo fiasco did indeed furnish to the insurgent cause aid and comfort at the psychological moment when it most needed encouragement to bring things to a head. It presented a spectacle of vacillation and seeming cowardice which heartened the timid among the insurgents and started among them a general eagerness for war which had been lacking before. In one of his bulletins 163, to Otis, General Miller tells of 2 boats' crews of the 51st Iowa landing on January 5th, and being met by a force of armed natives who asked him their business and warned them off, whereupon they heeded the warning and returned to their transport. The regiment had then been cooped up on their transport continuously since leaving San Francisco November 30. Previous 63 days, they were kept lying off Iloilo until January 29, and then brought back to Manila and landed, after 89 days, aboard ship. all idea of taking Iloilo before the Senate should act having been abandoned. The benevolent assimilation proclamation was received by cable in cipher at Manila, December 29, and as soon as it had been written out in longhand, General Otis hurried a copy down to General Miller at Iloilo by a ship sailing that day, so that General Miller might understand the position and policy of our government, but he forgot to tell Miller to conceal the policy for the present, 164, so the latter, on January 1st, not only sent a copy of it to the President of the Federal Government of Visayas, M.R. Lopez, 165, but in the note of transmittal he asked, says his report, that they permit the entry of my troops, 166. What a fatal mistake. Here was a proclamation representing all the majesty, dominion, and power of the American government, signed by the President of the United States, in terms asserting immediate, absolute, and supreme authority, and the natives were asked if they would permit its enforcement. General Miller's report says that he also had the proclamation translated into Spanish and distributed to the people, 167. The people laugh at it. He says, the insurgents call us cowards and are fortifying at the point of the peninsula and are mounting old smooth bore guns left by the Spaniards. They are entrenching everywhere, are bent on having one fight, and are confident of victory. The longer we wait before we attack, the harder it will be to put down the insurrection. This is especially interesting in the light of President McKinley's justification of the wisdom of temporizing on the idea that delay would weaken the insurgents and could not hurt us. Let no one convince you, writes Miller to Otis on January 5th, that peaceful means can settle the difficulty here. The appeal to Otis to permit commencement of operations was without avail. Otis was the Manila agent of the Aldrich Old Guard in the Senate, in charge of the pending treaty. He would simply send the disgusted Miller messages not to be hasty, assuring him that the firing of a shot at Iloilo would mean the precipitation of general conflict about Manila and all over the place, and that this would be most disappointing to the President of the United States, who continually urges extreme caution and no conflict, 168. The administration was counting senatorial noses at the time, and that its anxiety was justified is apparent from the fact already noted, that on the final vote whereby the treaty was ratified it had but one vote to spare. So General Miller sat sunning himself on the deck of his transport, and watching the insurgents working like ants at their fortifications, and vainly wishing his 2,500 men could get a short lease long enough to stretch themselves a bit. John F. Bass, correspondent for Harper's Weekly, left Iloilo, returned to Manila, and wrote his paper on January 23. I returned to Manila well knowing that there was nothing more to be done in Iloilo until the Senate voted on the Treaty of Peace. On the 8th day after General Miller had asked permission of the Iloilo village Hamptons to enforce the orders of the President of the United States, the federal government of the Visayas, through its president, Senor Lopez, finally deigned to notice M.R. McKinley's proclamation. It said under date of January 9th, General, we have the high honor of having received your message, dated January 1st of this year. In closing letter of President McKinley, you say in one clause of your message, as indicated in the President's cablegram, under these conditions the inhabitants of the island of Panay ought to obey the political authority of the United States, and they will incur a grave responsibility if, after deliberating, they decide to resist said authority. So the Council of State of this region of Visayas are, at this present moment, between the authority of the United States, that you try to impose on us, and the authority of the central government of Malolos. Then follows this remarkable statement of the case for the Filipinos. The supposed authority of the United States began with the Treaty of Paris, on the 10th of December, 1898. The authority of the central government of Malolos is founded in the sacred and natural bonds of blood, language, uses, customs, ideas, and sacrifices, 169. General Otis was fond of throwing cold water on any particularly eloquent Filipino insurrecto document he had occasion to put in his reports by saying that Mabini was the brains of the Malolos government, meaning the only brains it had. 170. and that he probably wrote such document, whatever it might be. But here is a piece of real eloquence, originating away down in the Visayas Islands, as far away from Malolos as Colonel Stark and his Green Mountain Boys were from Washington and Hamilton in 1776 and after. What then is the explanation of composition? So forceful in its impassioned simplicity, and in the light of subsequent events, so pathetic? There is but one explanation: it came from the heart. It was the cry of the soul, of humanity seeking its natural affiliations. It was the language of what Aguinaldo's early state papers always used to call the legitimate aspirations of his people, legitimate aspirations which we later strangled. The reason of the writer's earnestness is that a few months later he helped do some of the strangling. 13 years afterwards, a thorough acquaintance with the Filipino side of the matter, derived from an examination of the information which has been gradually accumulated and published by our government during that time, causes him to say, "Father, forgive me, for I knew not what I did." The 35,000 volunteers of 1899 knew nothing about the Filipinos or their side of the case. We were like the deputy sheriff who goes out with a warrant duly issued to arrest a man charged with unlawful breach of the peace. It is not his business to inquire whether the man is guilty or not. If the man resists arrest, he takes the consequences. On the second day after the above defiance of the President of the United States was served up to General Miller, that gallant officer, having dutifully swallowed it, sent an officer ashore on a diplomatic mission. The name and rank of this military ambassador were Acting Assistant Surgeon Henry Duar, felon, who clearly appears to have been a man of keen insight and considerable ability. His written report to General Miller of what transpired is a document of permanent interest and importance to the annals of men's struggles for free institution. 171. It states that at the meeting, the spokesman of the Filipinos, Attorney Raymundo Melisa, began by saying that all the Americans owned was Manila. That was unquestionably true, so our ambassador, it seems, did not gainsay it. Dr. Felon suggested that the Americans had sacrificed lives and money in destroying the power of Spain. The spokesman, Attorney Melisa, replied that they also had made great sacrifice in lives, and that they had a right to their country which they had fought for, and that we are here now to take from them what they had won by fighting. That they had been our allies, and we had used them as such. Dr. Felon's report goes on to say, I replied that military occupation was a necessity for a time, and that as soon as order was assured it would be withdrawn. They smiled at this. Well, they might. 14 years have elapsed since then, and the lawmaking power of the United States has never yet declared whether the American occupation of the Philippine Islands is to be temporary, like our occupation of Cuba was, or permanent, like the British occupation of Egypt is. True, Dr. Felon said. Military occupation, but the smile was provoked by the suggestion of temporariness. After the committee smiled, they remarked, "We have fought for independence and feel that we have the power of governing and need no assistance. We are showing it now. You might inquire of the foreigners if it is not so." Dr. Felon's report proceeds. They stated that their orders were not to allow us to disembark, and that they were powerless to allow us to come in without express orders from their government. In regard to the Treaty of Paris, the spokesman, Lawyer Melisa, said, "International law forbids a nation to make a contract in regard to taking the liberties of its colonies." Lawyer Melisa was wrong. If he had said the law of righteousness instead of international law, his proposition, thus amended, would have been incontrovertible. On September 19, 1911, one of the great newspapers of this country, the Denver Post, sent out to the members of the Congress of the United States, and to the Fourth Estate also, the newspaper editors, a circular letter proposing that we sell the Philippine Islands to Japan. A member of the United States Senate sent this answer: "I do not favor your proposition. Selling the islands means selling the inhabitants. The question of traffic in human beings, whether by wholesale or retail, was forever settled by the Civil War." About the same time, a leading daily paper of Georgia had an editorial on the Denver Post's proposition. The most conspicuous feature of which was that Japan was too poor to pay us well, should we contemplate selling the Filipinos to her, so it was no use to discuss the matter at length. No. Lawyer Meliza's proposition has no standing in international law yet, but it has with what M.R. Lincoln's first inaugural called the better angels of our nature, if we stop to reflect. Another interesting feature of the Felon report to General Miller is the following. I asked Lawyer Meliza if Aguinaldo said we could occupy the city, would they agree to it? He replied most emphatically that they would. At that time, in January 1899, while the debate on the treaty was in progress in the United States Senate, there was hardly a province in that archipelago where you would not have encountered the same inflexible adherence to the Aguinaldo government. Dr. Felon's report closes thus. At the conclusion of the meeting it was said that as this question involved the integrity of the entire republic, it could not be further discussed here, but must be referred to the Malolos government. There is one other statement made by the spokesman of the Filipinos at their meeting with Drive Felon, which arrested and gripped my attention. That it may interest the reader as it did me, it will need but a word or so as preface. In the fall of that same year, 1899, when my regiment, the 29th Infantry, U.S. Volunteers, reached the islands, it was supposed that the insurrection had about played out, i.e. that it had been beaten to a frazzle, because the Filipinos no longer offered to do battle in force in the open. Yet all that fall, and all through 1900 and after, a most obstinate guerrilla warfare was kept up. Anywhere in the archipelago you were liable to be fired on from ambush. At first we could not understand this, later we found out it was the result of an order of Aguinaldo's, faithfully carried out, not to assemble in large commands, but to conduct a systematic guerrilla warfare indefinitely. We learned this by capturing a copy of the order, which was quite elaborate. Dr. Felon's report says, I told him militia that the city was in our power, and that we could destroy it at any time. Lawyer Militia replied that he cared nothing about the city, that we could destroy it if we wished. We will withdraw to the mountains and repeat the North American Indian warfare. You must not forget that. Later, they did. On January 15th, General Otis wrote General Miller 172, again, cautioning him against any clash at Iloilo, and saying of conditions at Manila and Malolos, the revolutionary government is very anxious for peaceful relations. 3 days later Senator Bacon saw the situation with clearer vision from the other side of the world than General Otis could see it, under his nose, and said on the floor of the Senate on January 18, concerning the conditions at Manila and Malolos, while there is no declaration of war, while there is no avowal of hostile intent, with two such armies fronting each other with such diverse intent and resolves, it will take but a spark to ignite the magazines which is to explode. 173. This spark was ignited on February 4, 1899, by a sentinel of the Nebraska Regiment firing on some Filipino soldiers who disregarded his challenge to halt, and killing one of them. War wounds on General Miller was directed on February 10, after he had lain in Iloilo harbor for 44 days, to take the city. So at last he gave written notice to the insurgents in Iloilo demanding the surrender of the city and garrison before sunset Saturday, the 11th instant, and requesting them to give warning to all non-combatants. 174. Thereupon the insurgents set fire to the city and departed. Chapter X. Otis and Aguinaldo, continued. A word spoken in due season, how good is it? Proverbs XV 23. In the last chapter we saw the debut of the benevolent assimilation program at Iloilo. We are now to observe it at Manila. General Otis says in his report for 1899-175. After fully considering the President's proclamation and the temper of the Tagalos with whom I was daily discussing political problems and the friendly intentions of the United States government toward them, I concluded that there were certain words and expressions therein, such as sovereignty, right of cession, and those which directed immediate occupation, etc., which might be advantageously used by the Tagala war party to incite widespread hostilities among the natives. It was my opinion therefore, that I would be justified in so amending the paper that the beneficent object of the United States government would be clearly brought within the comprehension of the people. Accordingly, he published a proclamation as indicated, on January 4th, at Manila. In a less formal communication concerning this proclamation, viz. A letter to General Miller at Iloilo, General Otis comes to the point more quickly thus. After some deliberation we put out one of our own which it was believed would save the temper of the people, 176. The only thing in the Otis proclamation specifically directed toward soothing the temper of the people was a hint that the United States would, under the government it was going to impose, appoint the representative men now forming the controlling element of the Filipinos to civil positions of responsibility and trust, p. 69, and this, far from soothing Filipino temper, was interpreted as an offer of a bribe if they would desert the cause of their country. The bona fides of the offer they did not doubt for a moment. In fact, it caught a number of the more timid prominent men, especially the elderly ones, of the ultra-conservative element preferring submission to strife, but the younger and bolder spirits were faithful, many of them unto death, and all of them unto many battles and much hiking, 177. General Otis's report goes on to tell how, about the middle of January, after he had published his sugar-coated edition of the presidential proclamation at Manila, it then at last occurred to him that General Miller might have published the original text of it in full at Iloilo, and, fearing that, says he, I again dispatched Liud, Call, Potter to Iloilo evidently post-haste, but it appears that when the breathless Potter arrived, the lid was already off, the horse had left the stable, and the door was open, as we saw in the preceding chapter. However, as a Otis report indicates in this connection, p. 67, copies of the original McKinley Proclamation, as published in full at Iloilo by General Miller, were of course promptly forwarded by the insurgents at Iloilo to the insurgent government at Malolos, so all that General Otis got for his pains was detection in the attempt to conceal the crucial words asserting American sovereignty in plain English. He tells us himself that as soon as the Malolos people discovered the trick, the proclamation became in the light of the Otis doctoring the object of venomous attack. His report was of course written long after all these matters occurred, but its language shows a total failure on the part of its author, even then, to understand the cause of the bitterness he denominates venom. This bitterness grew naturally out of what seemed to the Filipinos an evident purpose of the United States to take and keep the islands and an accompanying unwillingness to acknowledge that purpose, as shown by the conspicuous discrepancies between the original text of the proclamation as published at Iloilo by General Miller on January 1st, and the modified version of it given out by General Otis at Manila on January 4th, the ablest of the insurgent newspapers, says he, p. 69, which was now issued at Malolos and edited by the uncompromising Luna, attacked the policy as declared in the proclamation, and its assumption of sovereignty with all the vigor of which he was capable. The nature of editor Luna's philippics is not described by General Otis in detail, the only specific notion we get of them being from General Otis's echo of their tone, which, he tells us, was to the effect that everything tended simply to a change of masters, but in another part of the Otis report, p. 163, we find an epistle written about that time by one partisan of the revolution to another, whose keynote, given in the following extracts, was doubtless in harmony with the Luna editorials. We shall not have them, Filipinos, enough to conduct a decent government in 10, 20, or 100 years, because the Yankees will never acknowledge the aptitude of an inferior race to govern the country. Do not dream that when American sovereignty is implanted in the country the American office holders will give up. Never! If it depends upon them to say whether the Filipinos have sufficient men for the government of the country, they will never say it. Is not the American who pretends that he would have done anything but just what the Filipinos did, had he been in their place, he fought to the last ditch for the independence of his country, the rankest sort of a hypocrite? General Otis was a soldier, and his views may have been honest and colored by his environment, but how at this late date can any fair-minded man read the above extracts illustrative of the temper in which the Filipinos went to war with us without acknowledging the righteousness of the motives which impelled them? Aguinaldo promptly met General Otis's proclamation of January 4th by a counter-proclamation put out the very next day, in which he indignantly protested against the United States assuming sovereignty over the islands, even the women, says General Otis, p. 70, in a document numerously signed by them, gave me to understand that after the men were all killed off they were prepared to shed their patriotic blood for the liberty and independence of their country. General Otis actually intended this last as a sly touch of humor, but when we recollect M.R. Millet's description, Chapter 4, of the women coming to the trenches and cooking rice for the men while the Filipinos were slowly drawing their cordon ever closer about the doomed Spanish garrison of Manila in July and August previous, fighting their way over the ground between them and the besieged main body of their ancient enemies in Chbayanj, while Admiral Dewey blockaded them by sea. General Otis's sly touch of humor loses some of its slyness. The insurgent army also, he says, p. 70, was especially affected, and only awaited an opportunity to demonstrate its invincibility in war with the United States troops whom it had commenced to insult and charge with cowardice. The benetted condition of the insurgents in this regard was directly traceable to the Iloilo fiasco. It was that, principally, which made the insurgents so foolishly overconfident and the subsequent slaughter of them so tremendous. Further on in his report, General Otis says, with perceptible petulance, in summing up his case against the Filipinos, the pretext that the United States was about to substitute itself for Spain was resorted to and had its effect on the ignorant masses. Speaking of his own modified version of the benevolent assimilation proclamation, General Otis says, p. 76. No sooner was it published than it brought out a virtual declaration of war from, in this instance at least, the wretchedly advised President Aguinaldo, who, on January 5th, issued the following. Giving the reply proclamation in full, no man can read the Otis report itself without feeling that if he, the reader, had been playing Aguinaldo's hand he would have played it exactly as Aguinaldo did. 2. General Otis, the government at Malolos, their Malolos arrangement, he used to call it, seemed quite an impudent little opera booth affair, a tin horn government, as Senator Spooner suggested in the same debate on the treaty, in which he called his rugged and fiery friend from South Carolina, Senator Tillman, the senator from Aguinaldo, and immediately thereafter, with that engaging frankness that always so endeared him to his colleagues on both sides of the chamber, removed the sting from the jest by admitting that neither he, Spooner, nor Tillman, nor anybody else in the United States, knew anything about Aguinaldo or his government, but in the calm retrospective, many years after, we have seen, through the official documents which have become available in the interval, that said government was in complete and effective control of practically the whole archipelago, and had the moral support of the whole population at a time when our troops controlled absolutely nothing but the two towns of Manila and Cavite. Therefore, when we read in the Aguinaldo proclamation such phrases as, "In view of this, I summoned a council of my generals and asked the advice of my cabinet, and in conformity with the opinion of both bodies I did so and so," my government cannot remain indifferent to this or that act of the Americans assuming sovereignty over the islands. Thus it is that my government is disposed to open hostilities, if etc. They do not sound to us so irritatingly bombastic as they did to General Otis, distributed under his nose as the proclamation containing them at once was, by thousands, throughout a city of which he was nominally in possession, but 9/10 of whose 300,000 inhabitants he was obliged to believe in sympathy with the insurgents. My government, says the Aguinaldo proclamation, rules the whole of Luzon, the Visayas Islands, and a part of Mindanao, except as to Mindanao, which cut absolutely no figure in the insurrection until well toward the end of the guerrilla part of it, we have already examined. This claim was found by careful analysis that it was absolutely true by the end of December 1898. After rapid review of how he had been aided and encouraged in starting the revolution against the Spaniards by Admiral Dewey, and then given the cold shoulder by the army when it came, Aguinaldo's manifesto says, it was also taken for granted that the American forces would necessarily sympathize with the revolution which they had managed to encourage, and which had saved them much blood and great hardships. And, above all, we entertain absolute confidence in the history and traditions of a people which fought for its independence and for the abolition of slavery, and which posed as the champion and liberator of oppressed peoples. We felt ourselves under the safeguard of a free people. That this statement also is authorized by the facts is evident from the minutes of the Hong Kong meeting of May 4th, already noticed, presided over by Aguinaldo, and called to formulate the program for the insurrection he was about to sail for the Philippines to inaugurate, in which, after much discussion among the revolutionary leaders, it was agreed that while they must be prepared for all possible contingencies, yet, if Washington proposes to carry out the fundamental principles of its constitution, it is most improbable that an attempt will be made to colonize the Filipinos or annex them. 178. In short, the Aguinaldo Proclamation of January 5th suggests with a briefness which Filipino familiarity with the great mass of facts already laid before the reader in the preceding chapters made appropriate all the causes for which the Malolos government was ready, if need be, to declare war, and brings up by boldly serving General Otis with notice that if the Americans try to take Iloilo and the Visayan Islands, my government is disposed to open hostilities. On January 9th, President McKinley cabled out to General Otis asking if it would help matters to send a commission out to explain to the Filipinos our benevolent intentions. This idea, as suggested, materialized a few weeks later in the Sherman Commission, of which, more anon. The next day, January 10, General Otis answered endorsing the sending of commissioners of tact and discretion, and adding, 178. Great difficulty is that leaders cannot control ignorant classes. 179. As a matter of fact, the leaders were leading, they were not arguing with the tide, they were merely riding the crest of it. Actually, General Otis would have stopped the 600 Marseillais who knew how to die, the ones whose march to Paris, according to Thomas Carlyle, inspired the composition of the French national air, the Marseillaise, and tried to parley with the head of the column on the idea of getting them to abandon their enterprise and disperse to their several homes. He also says, in the cablegram under consideration, if peace kept for several days more, immediate danger will have passed. In other words, he was holding off the calf as best he could pending the ratification of the treaty. From the text itself, however, of General Otis's report, it is clear enough that even he was getting anxious to give the Filipinos a drubbing as soon as the treaty should be safely passed, referring to a message from the President enjoining avoidance of a clash with the Filipinos. He says, p. 80. The injunction of His Excellency the President of the United States to exert ourselves to preserve the peace had an excellent effect upon the command. Officers and men were restless under the restraints imposed, and eager to avenge the insults received. Now they submit very quietly to the taunts and aggressive demonstrations of the insurgent army, who continue to throng the streets of the business portion of the city. See the lamb kick the lion viciously in the face, and observe the lion as he first lifts his eyes heavenward and says meekly, "Thy will be done." This is benevolent assimilation. And then turns them Senatward and murmurs, "I cannot stand this much longer, kind sirs, say when." The way war correspondent John F. Bass puts the situation about this time in a letter to his paper, Harper's Weekly, like this. Jimmy Green 180 bites his lip, hangs on to himself, and finds comfort in the idea that his time will come. After Aguinaldo's ultimatum of January 5th about fighting if we took Iloilo, General Otis refrained from taking Iloilo, and continued to communicate with the insurgent chieftain, appointing commissioners to meet commissioners appointed by him. These held divers and sundry sessions, whose only result was to kill time, or at least to mark time, while the administration was getting the treaty through the Senate. The object of these meetings is as set forth in the Military Order of January 9, 1899, appointing the Otis portion of the Joint High Parling Board to meet a commission of like number appointed by General Aguinaldo, and to confer with regard to the situation of affairs and to arrive at a mutual understanding of the intent, purposes, aim, and desires of the Filipino people and the people of the United States, that peace and harmonious relations between these respective peoples may be continued. 181. The minutes of the first meeting of this board, prepared by the Spanish-speaking clerk or recorder, recite the above declared purpose verbatim in all its verbosity, and then go on to say that our side asked that the commissioners appointed by General Aguinaldo give their opinion as to what were the purposes, aspirations, aims, and desires of the people of the archipelago. The next paragraph is almost Pickwickian in its unconscious terseness. To this request the commissioners appointed by General Aguinaldo made response that in their opinion the aspirations, purposes, and desires of the Philippine people might be summed up in two words: absolute independence. Of course even General Otis does not reproduce this laconic answer as part of his petulant summing up of how little the Filipinos knew before the outbreak of February 4th as to what they really wanted. He merely alludes to it as being of record elsewhere. It is 10 pound, the various pieces of jetsam and flotsam that have floated from the sea those great events to the shores of government publications, since the minutes of these meetings may be found among the hearings before the Senate Committee of 1902, 182. General Otis's report complains that Aguinaldo's commissioners did not know what they wanted, could not give any satisfactory explanation of the measure of protection they wanted, they having declared that they would greatly prefer the United States to establish a protectorate over them to keep them from being annexed by some other power. But he fails to state, which is a fact shown by the minutes of the meeting of January 14, p. 2721, that the Filipino commissioners did say that this was a question which would only be reached between their government and ours when the latter should agree to officially recognize the former. To quote their exact language, which is rather clumsily translated, they said, "The aspiration of the Filipino people is the independence with the restrictions resulting from the conditions which its government may agree with the American, when the latter agree to officially recognize the former." It is perfectly clear from the voluminous minutes of the proceedings that the Filipinos were only seeking some declaration of the purpose of our government which would satisfy their people, that the program was something more than a mere change of masters. They begged, says General Otis, p. 82, for some tangible concession from the United States government, one which they could present to the people, and which might serve to allay excitement. General Otis of course had no authority to bind the government and so could make no promise, but the day this Otis Aguinaldo Parling Board had its second meeting, January 11, and probably with no more knowledge of its existence than the reader has of what is going on in the Asianas of the moment he reads these lines, Senator Bacon introduced in the United States Senate some resolutions which were precisely the medicine the case required and precisely the thing the Filipinos were pleading for. These resolutions concluded thus: that the United States hereby disclaim any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said islands except for the pacification thereof, and assert their determination when an independent government shall have been duly erected therein entitled to recognition as such, to transfer to said government, upon terms which shall be reasonable and just, all rights secured under the cession by Spain, and to thereupon leave the government and control of the islands to their people. They were a twin brother to the Telecuban resolution which was incorporated into the resolution declaring war against Spain, being verbatim the same, except with the necessary changes of name, of islands for island, etc. On January 18, while the feudal parling board aforesaid was still feudally parling at Manila, Senator Bacon made an argument in the Senate in support of this resolution, whose far-sighted statesmanship, considered in relation to the analogies of its historic setting, most strikingly reminds us of Burke's great speech on conciliation, with America delivered under similar circumstances nearly a century and a quarter earlier, after alluding to the naturalness of the apprehension of the Filipinos that it is the purpose of the United States government to maintain permanent dominion over them, 183, Senator Bacon urged. The fundamental requirement in these resolutions is that the government of the United States will not undertake to exercise permanent dominion over the Philippine Islands. The resolutions are intentionally made broad, so that those who agree on that fundamental proposition may stand upon them even though they may differ materially as to a great many other things relative to the future course of the government in connection with the Philippine Islands. Senator Bacon then quoted the following from some remarks Senator Forker had previously made in the course of the great debate on the treaty. I do not understand anybody to be proposing to take the Philippine Islands with the idea and view of permanently holding them. The President of the United States does not, I know, and no senator in this chamber has made any such statement. And added, if the views expressed by the learned senator from Ohio in his speech are those upon which we are to act, there is very little difference between us. And there will be no future contention between us if we can have an authoritative expression from the lawmaking power of the United States in a joint resolution that such is the purpose of the future. 184. Says the Holy Scripture, a word spoken in season, how good is it? Had the Bacon resolutions passed the United States Senate in January 1899, we never would have had any war with the Filipinos. 185. They would have presented at the psychologic moment the very thing the best and bravest of the Filipino leaders were then pleading with General Otis for, something tangible, something which they could present to their people and which would allay excitement by allaying the universal fear that we were going to do with them exactly as all other white men they had ever heard of had done with all other brown men they had ever heard of under like circumstances, this keep them under permanent dominion with a view of profit. In his letter accepting the nomination for the presidency in 1900, M.R. McKinley sought to show the Filipinos to have been the aggressors in the war by reference to the fact that the outbreak occurred while the Bacon resolution was under discussion in the Senate. This hardly came with good grace from an administration whose friends in the Senate had all along opposed not only the Bacon resolution but also all other resolutions frankly declaratory of the purpose of our government. The supreme need of the hour then was, and the supreme need of every hour of every day we have been in the Philippines since, has been, an authoritative expression from the lawmaking power of the United States, not mere surmises of a president, confessedly devoid of binding force, but an authoritative expression from the lawmaking power, declaratory of the purpose of our government with regard to the Philippine Islands. Secretary of War Taft visited Manila in 1907 to be present at the opening of the Philippine Assembly, in view of the universal longing which he knew existed for some definite, authoritative declaration as to whether our government intends to keep the islands permanently or not. He said, I cannot speak with authority. The policy to be pursued with respect to them is, therefore, ultimately for Congress to determine. I have no authority to speak for Congress in respect to the ultimate disposition of the islands. 186. This bitter disappointment of the public expectation and hope of something definite certainly did not lessen the belief of the Filipinos that we have no notion of ever giving them their independence. Had the Senate known what the Filipino commissioners were so earnestly asking of the Otis commissioners in January 1899, the Bacon resolution would probably have passed. In fact, it is demonstrable almost mathematically that, had the administration's friends in the Senate allowed that resolution to come to a vote before the outbreak of February 4th, instead of filibustering against it until after that event, it would have passed, as stated in the footnote. The roll call on the final vote on it, which was not taken until February 14th, showed a tie, 29 to 29. The Vice President of the United States, casting the deciding vote which defeated it. Much dealing with real life and real death has blunted my artistic sensibilities to thrills from the mere pantomime of the stage, but as here was a vote where, had a single senator who voted no voted aye, some $300 million over 1,000 lives of American soldiers killed in battle, some 16,000 lives of Filipino soldiers killed in battle, and possibly 100,000 Filipino lives snuffed out through famine, pestilence, and other ills consequent on the war, would have been saved. I cannot refrain from reproducing the vote, perhaps the most uniquely momentous single roll call in the parliamentary history of Christmas 187. Ayes. Bacon Jones of Nevada, Babe Lindsay, Barry McClellan, Catherine Martin, Chilton Money, Clay Murphy, Cockrell Perkins, Faulkner Pettigrew, Gorman Pettis, Gray Key, Hale Rollins, Harris Smith, Highfield Tillman, Hort Turner, Jones of Arkansas. Nays. Allison Mental, Burroughs Morgan, Carter Nelson, Chandler Penrose, DeBoe Platt of Connecticut, Fairbanks Platt of New York, Fra Pritchard, Gear Ross, Hannah Shoup, Holly Simon, Kyle Stewart, Lodge Teller, McBride Warren, McHenry Wolcott, Macmillan. In January 1899, the out-and-out land grabbers had not yet made bold to show their hand, the friends of the treaty confining themselves to the alleged shame of doing as we had done with Cuba, on account of the proposed semi-barbarous condition of the various tribes out there, leaving the possibility of profit to quietly suggest itself amid the noisy exhortations of altruism. It was not until after the milk of human kindness had been spilled in war that Senator Lodge said at the Philadelphia National Republican Convention of 1900, "We make no hypocritical pretense of being interested in the Philippines solely on account of others. We believe in trade expansion." Speaking, p. 82, of the meetings of what, for lack of a better term, I have above called the Otis Aguinaldo Joint High Parling Board, General Otis says in his report. Finally, the conferences became the object of insurgent suspicion and amusement. The Filipino newspapers called attention to the fact that large reinforcements of American troops were on the way to Manila, and Gary plausibly inferred that the parling was for delay only. By January 26, the politeness of both the American and the Filipino commissioners had been worn to a frazzle, and they adjourned, each recognizing that the differences between them could ultimately be settled only on the field of battle, in the event of the ratification of the treaty. January 27, General Otis cabled to Washington a letter from Aguinaldo, of which he says in his report, "I was surprised, because of the boldness with which he therein indicated his purpose to continue his assumptions and establish their correctness by the arbitrament of war." p. 84, General Otis was surprised to the last. Aguinaldo's letter is not at all surprising, though extremely interesting. It sends General Otis a proclamation issued January 21st, announcing the publication of a constitution modeled substantially after that of the United States, even beginning with the familiar words about securing the blessings of liberty, promoting the general welfare, etc., and concludes with an expression of confident hope that the United States will recognize his government, and a bold implication of determination to fight if it does not. On the evening of February 4th, an insurgent soldier approaching an American picket failed to halt or answer when challenged, and was shot and killed. Nearly 6 months of nervous tension thereupon pressed for liberation in a general engagement which continued throughout the night and until towards sundown of the next day, thus finally unleashing the dogs of war. In the Washington Post of February 6, 1899, Senator Bacon is quoted as saying, "I will cheerfully vote all the money that may be necessary to carry on the war in the Philippines, but I still maintain that we could have avoided a conflict with those people had the Senate adopted my resolution, or a similar resolution announcing our honest intentions with regard to the Philippines," said the New York Criterion of February 11, 1899. "Whether we like it or not, we must go on slaughtering the natives, in the English fashion, and taking what mighty glory lies in this wholesale killing until they had learned to respect our arms. The more difficult task of getting them to respect our intentions will follow." The Washington Post of February 6, 1899, may not have quoted Senator Bacon with exactitude, but what the senator did say on the floor of the Senate is important. Historically, under date of February 22, 1912, Senator Bacon writes me, in answer to an inquiry, "I enclose a speech made by me upon the subject in the Senate, February 27, 1899, and upon pages 6, 7, and 8 of which you will find a statement of my position and the reasons given by me. Therefore, of course you cannot go at length into that question in your narration of the events of that day, but my position was that, while I did not approve of the war, and did not approve of the enslavement of the Filipinos, and while if I had my way I would immediately set them free, at the same time, as war was then flagrant, and there were then some 20-odd thousand American troops in the Philippine Islands, we must either support them or leave them to defeat and death. I do not know how far you can use anything then said by me, but if you make allusion to the fact that I was willing to supply money and troops to carry on the war in the Philippines, I would be glad for it to be accompanied by a very brief statement of the ground upon which I based such action. The above makes it unnecessary to quote at length from the speech referred to, which may be found at pp. 2456 et seq of the Congressional Record for February 27, 1899. However, there is one passage in the speech to which I especially say amen, and invite all whose creative patriotism is not too sublimated for such a common feeling to join me in so doing. Senator Bacon will now state the creed. The oft-repeated expression "our country, right or wrong," has a vital principle in it, and upon that principle I stand. The senator immediately follows his creed with these commentaries. In this annexation of the Philippine Islands through the ratification of the treaty, and in waging war to subjugate the Filipinos, I think the country, acting through constitutional authorities, is wrong, but it is not for me to say because the country has been committed to a policy that I do not favor and have opposed, in consequence of which there is war, that I will not support the government. Under the civilizing influence of Krag-Jorgensen rifles and the moral uplift of high explosive projectiles, what our soldiers used to call, with questionable piety, the fear of God, was finally put into the hearts of the Filipinos, after much carnage by wholesale and battle formation and later by retail in a species of guerrilla warfare as irritating as it was obstinate, but they have never yet learned to respect our intentions, because under the guidance of 3 successive presidents we have studiously refrained from any authoritative declaration as to what those intentions are. We are loath to hark back to the only right course, a course similar to our action in Cuba, because of the expense we have into in the Philippines, but we also know that the islands are and are likely to continue a costly burden, a nuisance, and a distinct strategic disadvantage in the event of war. And that M.R. Cleveland was right when he said, "The government of remote and alien people should have no permanent place in the purposes of our national life." The mistaken policy which involved us in a war to subjugate the Filipinos, following our war to free the Cubans, will never stand atoned for before the bar of history, nor can the Filipinos ever in reason be expected to respect their intentions until the lawmaking power of the government shall have authoritatively declared what those intentions are. And what we intend ultimately to do with the islands. Senator Bacon's resolutions of 1899 were, are, and always will be the last word and the first act needed to rectify the original Philippine blunder, announcing as they would, to use the language attributed to their distinguished author by the Washington Post of February 6, 1899, above quoted, our honest intentions with regard to the Philippines, so eager is the exploiter to exploit the islands, and so apprehensive is the Filipino that the exploiter will have more influence at Washington than himself and therefore be able ultimately to bring about a practical industrial slavery, that common honesty demands such a declaration. To Dr. Present Filipino does contend with benevolent uncertainty is a mere makeshift. The remedy the situation is simple, but is yet untried. Practice, the chief of the causes of the present discontent among the Filipinos with American rule is precisely the same old serpent that precipitated the war 13 years ago, to wit, lack of a frank and honest declaration of our purpose. The trouble then lay, and still lies, and, in the absence of some such declaration as that proposed by the Bacon resolution, will always lie in what seemed then, and still, seems, to the Filipinos an evident purpose to keep the islands and an accompanying unwillingness to acknowledge that purpose. Some may object that one Congress cannot bind another. The same argument would have killed the Tiller Amendment to the Declaration of War with Spain avowing our purpose as to Cuba. Such an argument assumes that this nation has no sense of honor, and that it should cling for a while longer to the stale Macalvarism that the islands may yet pay, before it decides whether it will do right or not, and signalizes such decision by formal announcement through Congress. To men capable of such an assumption as the one just indicated, this book is not addressed. 3 successive presidents, Messrs. McKinley, Roosevelt, and Taft, have with earnest asseveration of benevolent intention tried, without success all these years, to win the affections of the Filipino people, and to make them feel that our flag had not lost its gift of benediction in its worldwide journey to their shores, as M.R. McKinley used to say. But the cornerstone of the policy was laid before we knew anything about how the land lay, and on the assumption, made practically without any knowledge whatever on the subject, that the Filipino people were incapable of self-government. The cornerstone of our Philippine policy has been from the beginning precisely that, urged by Spain for not freeing Cuba, viz. To spare the people from the dangers of premature independence. The 3 presidents named above have always been willing to imply independence, but never to promise it, and the unwillingness to declare a purpose ultimately to give the Filipinos their independence has always been due to the desire to catch the vote of those who are determined they shall never have it. In this inexorable and unchangeable political necessity lies the essential contemptibleness of Republican imperialism, and the secret of why the Filipinos, notwithstanding our good intentions, do not like us, and never will under the present policy. How can you blame them? Yet the more you know of the Filipinos, the better you like them. Self-sacrificing, brave, and faithful unto death in war, they are gentle, generous, and tractable in peace. Moreover, respect for constituted authority, as such, is innate in practically every Filipino, which I am not sure can be predicated concerning each and every citizen of my beloved native land, and we can win the grateful and lasting affection of the whole 7 or 8 millions of them any day we wish to. Have done with vague, vote-catching presidential obiter, and through your Congress declare your purpose. Chapters I. Otis and the War. Am I the boss, or am I a tool? Am I Governor General or a hobo? Now I'd like to know who's the boss of this show. Is it me, or Emilio Aguinaldo? Army Song of the Philippines under Otis. The thing is on, said General Hughes, Provost Marshal of Manila, to General Otis, at Malacanan Palace, on the night of February 4, 1899, about 8:30. As soon as the firing started, 188, he was talking about something which every American in Manila except General Otis had for months frankly recognized as inevitable, the war. On the day of the outbreak of February 4th, General Otis had under his command 838 officers and 20,032 enlisted men, say in round numbers, a total of 21,000. Of these, some 15,500 were state volunteers, mostly from the western states, and the rest were regulars. All the volunteers and 1,650 of the regulars were, or were about to become, entitled to their discharge, and the right was perfected by the exchange of ratifications of the Treaty of Peace with Spain on April 11, 1899. The total force which he was thus entitled to command for any considerable period consisted of less than 4,000 of the 21,000 men on hand as aforesaid on February 4th, deducting those at Cavite and Iloilo, the sick and wounded, those serving in civil departments, and in the staff organizations. The effective fighting force was 14,000, and of these 3,000 constituted the Provost Guard in the great and hostile city of Manila, 189. Thus there were only 11,000 men, including those entitled to discharge, available to engage the insurgent army, which, says Secretary of War Root, was 2 or 3 times that number, well armed and equipped, and included many of the native troops formerly comprised in the Spanish army. Such was the predicament into which General Otis's supremely zealous efforts to help the administration get the treaty through the Senate, by withholding from the American people the knowledge of facts which might have put them on notice that they were paying $20 million for a $200 million insurrection, had brought us. This is not a tale of Well, it is a tale of the disgust, good-humored, because stoical, which finally found expression at the time in the army song that heads this chapter, disgust at unnecessary sacrifice of American life which could so easily have been prevented had General Otis only revealed the real situation in time to have had plenty of troops on hand. It is a requiem over those brave men of the 8th Army Corps from Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and the western states that bore the brunt of the early fighting, whose lives were needlessly sacrificed in 1899 as a result of an unpreparedness for war due to anxiety not to embarrass M.R. McKinley in his efforts to get the treaty through the Senate, and unpreparedness which remained long unremedied thereafter in order to conceal from the people of the United States the unanimity of the desire of the Filipinos for independence. It is quite true that none of our people then in the island realized this unanimity in all its papers at the outset, but it soon became clear to everybody except the commanding general. It naturally dawned on him last of all, because he did not visit the most reliable sources of information, to wit, the battlefields during the fighting, and therefore did not see how tenaciously the Filipinos fought for the independence of their country. Moreover, General Otis tried to think till the last along lines in harmony with the original theory of benevolent assimilation, hence M.R. Root's nonsense of 1899 and 1900 about the patient and unconsenting millions dominated by the Tagalog Shrine, which nonsense was immensely serviceable in a campaign for the presidency wherein antidotes for sympathy with a people struggling to be freer of supreme practical political value. General Otis actually had M.R. McKinley believing as late as December 1899, at least, that the opposition to a change of masters in lieu of freedom was confined to a little coterie of self-seeking politicians who were in the business for what they could get out of it, and that the great majority would prefer him, Otis, to Aguinaldo as Governor-General. It is difficult on first blush to accept the statement as dispassionately correct, but there is no escape from the record. M.R. McKinley said in his annual message to Congress in December 1899, in reviewing the direction he gave to the Paris peace negotiations which ended in the purchase of the islands, and the war with the Filipinos which had followed, and had then been raging since February 4th previous. I had every reason to believe, and still believe, that the transfer of sovereignty was in accordance with the wishes and aspirations of the great mass of the Filipino people. Yet every American soldier who served in the Philippines at the time knows that Aguinaldo held the whole people in the hollow of his hand, because he was their recognized leader, the incarnation of their aspirations. 190. During the presidential campaign of 1900, while the war with the Filipinos was still raging, partisan rancor bitterly called in question the sincerity of President McKinley's statement in his annual message to Congress of December 1899, that he then still believed the transfer of sovereignty was in accord with the wishes and aspirations of the great mass of the Filipino people, on the ground that he must, by the time he made that statement, have understood how grossly, however, honestly, General Otis had misled him as to the unanimity and tenacity of the Filipino purpose. But it is only necessary to read Admiral Dewey's testimony before the Senate Committee of 1902 to understand M.R. McKinley's allusion in the same message to Congress of 1899 to the sinister ambition of a few leaders, and this, once understood, explains the other statement of the message. Admiral Dewey came home in the fall of 1899 and undoubtedly filled M.R. McKinley with the estimate of Aguinaldo which makes such painful reading in the Admiral's testimony of 1902 before the Senate Committee, where he abused Aguinaldo like a pickpocket, so to speak, saying his original motive was principally loot. 191. In the fall of 1899, Aguinaldo had issued a proclamation claiming that Admiral Dewey originally promised him independence, and Admiral Dewey had bitterly denounced this as a falsehood, so that the Admiral always cherished a very real resentment against the insurgent chief thereafter. His estimate of the Filipino leader as being in the insurrection merely for what he could get out of it was wholly erroneous, and has long since been exploded. All our generals of the early fighting and all Americans who have known him since being unanimous that Aguinaldo was and is a sincere patriot. but it undoubtedly explains M.R. McKinley's still clinging, in 1899, to the notion derived from General Otis that the insurrection did not have the moral and material backing of the whole Filipino people. The Filipino leaders were familiar with the spirit of our institutions. The men who controlled their councils were high-minded, educated, patriotic men. For myself and the officers and men under my command, wrote General Merito Aguinaldo in August 1898, just after the fall of Manila, I can say that we have conceived a high respect for the abilities and qualities of the Filipinos, and if called upon by the government to express an opinion, it will be to that effect. 192. The leaders believed that the American people did not fully understand the identity of the Philippine situation with that in Cuba, and that, if they had, the treaty would not have been ratified. They also knew the supreme futility of trying to get the facts before the American people by peaceful means, and it was really with the abandon of genuine patriotism that they plunged their country into war. We did not know it then, but we do know it now. It would be simply wooden-headed to affirm that they ever expected to succeed in a war with us. Of course, some of the Junistori, as General Bell calls them in one of his early reports, 193, grew very aggressive and insulting toward the less. But the thinking men went into the war for independence in a spirit of decent respect to the opinions of mankind, to correct the impression General Otis had communicated to M.R. McKinley, and through him to our people, in the hope that the more lives they sacrificed in such a war, they risked, and many of them lost, their own also, the nearer they would come to refuting the idea that they did not know what they wanted. It was the only way they had to appeal to Caesar, i.e. to the great heart of the American people. As the war grew more and more unpopular in the United States, the impression was more and more nursed here at home that the people did not really want independence, but were being coerced, and that they were like dumb-driven cattle. The striking similarity of these suggestions to those by which tyranny has always met the struggles of men to be free did not seem to occur to the American public. They were accepted as authoritative, being convenient also as an antidote to sympathy. General Otis had suppressed such words as sovereignty, protection, and the like from his original sugar-coated edition of the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation, offering an elaborate cock-and-bull explanation of why he did so. The Filipino answer to this took the form of a very clever newspaper cartoon representing an American in a Karamata, a kind of two-wheeled buggy, with a Filipino between the shafts pulling it. Which cartoon, of course, never reached the United States. The Filipinos had never heard the story on General Magna about Taiyoha Senkamin, 194, but they had heard of the jinrikishas of Japan, and they had read in Holy Writ and elsewhere of conquered people becoming hewers of wood and drawers of water to invading conquerors, and they are not without a sense of humor. It is a common mistake with many Americans, for quite a few among us suffer intellectually from over-sophistication, to suppose we monopolize all the sense of humor there is, and that alone is proof of a due sense of proportion. At any rate, the Filipinos, with all due respect to General Otis's good intentions, understood that sovereignty and protection meant alien domination, so there was nothing in the Otis notion that for them those words had a peculiar meaning which might be advantageously used by the Tagala War Party to incite, etc. 195. Having now gotten into a war on the theory that only a small fraction of the Filipino people were opposed to a new and unknown yoke in lieu of the old one, General Otis still continued to try to square his theory with the facts. For many months he sat at his desk in Manila cheerily waging war with an inadequate force, and retaining in the service and on the firing line after their terms of enlistment expired, under pretense that they consented to it willingly, a lot of fellows from Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and the western states, who had volunteered for the war with Spain, with intent to kill Spaniards, in order to free Cubans, and not with intent to kill Filipinos for also wanting to be free. Seeing nothing of the fighting himself, he of course failed to get a correct estimate of the tenacity of the Filipino purpose. No purpose is here entertained to suggest that any of those early volunteers went around preaching mutiny, or feeling mutinous. They did not originally like the Filipinos, especially Furthermore, they liked the Philippines less than they did the Filipinos, and they had a vague notion that someone had blundered, but it was not theirs to ask the reason why. Besides, the orders from Washington being not to clash with the Filipinos, at least until the treaty was ratified, the Filipino soldiers and subaltern officers had been calling them cowards for some time with impunity, so that as soon as the treaty was safely put over, they were very glad to let off steam by killing a few hundred of them. But their hearts were not in the fight, in the sense of clear and profound conviction of the righteousness of the war. However, war is war, and they were soldiers, and orders is orders, as Tommy Atkins says. So, let us turn to an honester, if grimmer, side of the picture. The first battle of the war began about 8:30 o'clock on the night of February 4th, and lasted all through that night and until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the next day. Our casualties numbered about 250 killed and wounded. The insurgent loss was estimated at 3,000. Those of the insurgents will never be known, says General Otis. 196. We buried 700 of them. 197. There was fighting pretty much all around Manila, for the insurgents had the city almost hemmed in, an arc of a circle, broken in places possibly, but several miles long, drawn about the city, would probably suggest the general idea of the enemy's lines. They had been allowed to dig trenches without interference while the debate in the Senate on the treaty was in progress. Pursuant to the temporary peace at any price program, the arc was broken into smithereens by 5 p.m. of February 5th, when the morning of February 6th came. Call James F. Smith, commanding the 1st Californias, was known as Infantus, and so was a large part of his regiment. No one seemed to know definitely his location, says the Otis report. 198. As a matter of fact, he had taken 2 battalions of his regiment and waded clean through the enemy's lines, and had to be sent for to come back to form again with the line of battle needed to protect the city. So the Californias probably carried off the pick of the laurels of the first day's fighting. General Anderson, commanding the 1st Division of the 8th Corps, threw them some very handsome, well-earned bouquets in his report, stating also that their colonel had shown the very best qualities of a volunteer officer. Why he limited it to volunteer does not appear, but is inferable from the well-known disposition of all regulars to consider all volunteers rookies. 199, and recommended that he be made a brigadier general, which shortly afterward was done. 200. It would be invidious to follow the various phases of the subsequent early fighting and single out one or more states. 201, and tell of the hard-earned and well-deserved honors they won, because space forbids a proper tribute to the heroism of all of them. As for the regulars, 202, they were the same they were at Santiago de Cuba, the same they always are anywhere you put them. When a newspaper man would come around a regular regiment during the fighting before Santiago, he would be told that they had no news to give him. We ain't heroes, we're regulars, they would say. After the outbreak of February 4th, all our people did well, acted nobly. Angels could no more, neither could devils, as shown by the losses inflicted on the enemy. There was more fighting outside Manila during the next 2 or 3 days, and when that was done the somewhat shattered insurgent legions had recoiled to the distantly visible foothills, convinced that their notion they could take Manila was very foolish and very rash. At the town of Caloocan, some 3 or 4 miles out to the north of Manila, were located the shops and roundhouses of the Manila and Dagupan Railway, which runs from Manila in a northwesterly direction, about 120 miles to Dagupan, and was then the only railroad in the archipelago. It was fed by a vast rich farming country, the Great Plain of Central Luzon. Naturally, the Central Plain which fed the railroad that traversed it and kept it steaming myriads of small farmers in touch with the great outside world was to be sooner or later the theater of war. To seize transportation is instinctively the first tactical move of a military man. Lieutenant General Luna, Commander-in-Chief, next to Aguinaldo, of the Revolutionary Forces, the man whom later Aguinaldo had shot, was just then at Caloocan with 4,000 men. So it fell to General MacArthur, commanding the 2nd Division of the 8th Corps, to move on Caloocan, which he did on February 10th. John F. Bess, correspondent for Harper's Weekly, writing from Manila, a short time after this, describes this movement. It was our first move away from the city of Manila, with a few masterly strokes of the pen, which I regret there is not space to reproduce here in full. M.R. Bass gives a vivid picture of the various engagements, and of a background of burning villages, smoke, fire, shot, and shell, the ceaseless tramp of tired and often bleeding feet, etc. Heroism, he says, became a matter of course and death an incident. Finally, his story pauses for a moment. Thus, the natural comment is that all this is merely war, the business of the soldier. True, nor do I think Jimmy Green M.R. Bass's name for our Tommy Atkins is troubled with heroics. He accepts the situation without excitement or hysterics. He has little feeling in this matter, for his heart is not in this fight. Here Brother Bass's moralizing ceases abruptly, and the contagious excitement of the hour catches him, just as it always does the average man under such circumstances. From La Loma Church you may get the full view of our long line, crossing the open field, evenly, steadily, irresistibly, like an enrolling wave on the beach. Watch the regiments go forward, and form under fire, and move on, and you will exclaim, magnificent, and you will gulp a little and feel proud without exactly knowing why. Then gradually the power of that line will force itself upon you, and you will feel that you must follow, that wherever that line goes you must go also. By and by you will be sorry, but for the present, the might of an American regiment has got possession of you. Anybody who has ever been with an American regiment in action knows exactly how the man who wrote that felt. The American who has never had the experience M.R. Bass describes above has missed one way of realizing the majesty of the power of the republic whereof he is privileged to be a citizen. For if there is one national trait which, more than any other, explains the greatness of our country, it is the instinct for organization, the fondness for self-multiplication to the nth power by intelligent cooperation with one's fellows to a common end, especially is the experience in question inspiring where the example of the field officers is particularly appropriate to the occasion. Take for instance the following, concerning the conduct of Major J. Franklin Bell in this advance on Pelican, from the report of Major Cobb, commanding the artillery. As the right cleared the head of the ravine, I could see Maj. J. F. Bell leading a company of Montana troops in front of the right, advancing, firing, toward entrenchments. He was on a black horse to the left, leading and cheering the men. His work was most gallant and especially cheering to me. 203. No mere scribe can magnify General Bell's matchless efficiency in action, but it is certainly inspiring to contemplate. There are no fuss and feathers about him, yet his power, proven on many a field in the Philippines, to kindle martial ardor by example, suggests the ubiquitous helmet of Navarre of Lord Macaulay's poem. A little later correspondent Bass develops what he meant by and by you will be sorry. You see, it is not comfortable business, this of hustling about among the dead and dying. In the excitement, you are so liable to step on the face of some poor devil you knew well, maybe a once warm friend. In this connection M.R. Bass says, there is this difference between the manner in which American and Filipino soldiers die. The American falls in a heap and dies hard. The Filipino stretches himself out, and when dead is always found in some easy attitude, generally with his head on his arms. They die the way a wild animal dies, in just such a position as one finds a deer or an antelope which one has shot in the woods. So far as the writer is advised and believes, nobody who knows John F. Bass ever suspected him of being a quitter. He must have been reading the London Standard, which said about that time, it is a little startling to find the liberators of Cuba engaged in suppressing a youthful republic which claims the sacred right of self-government. Bass had written his newspaper in August previous, after observing how pluckily the Filipinos had fought and licked the Spaniards, give them their independence and guarantee it to them. The overwhelming sentiment of the 8th Army Corps when we took the Philippines was against taking them, and those who had kept informed knew that the Senate had ratified the treaty by a majority, only one more than enough to squeeze it through, the vote having been 57 to 27, at least 56 being thus indispensable to make the necessary constitutional 2/3 of the 84 votes fund at Wall Street, and the white man's burden or land-grabbing contingent philanthropy, and 5%, as Secretary of the Treasury Lyman J. Gage put it at the time, were responsible for these shambles. M.R. Bass describes. At this juncture some soft-headed gentleman asked, "What is this man who writes this book driving at? Is he trying to show that the American soldiers in the Philippines in February 1899 all wanted to quit as soon as the war broke out?" Not at all. In the first place, it hardly lay in American soldier nature to want to quit when Aguinaldo was telling us, "If you don't take your flag down and out of these islands at once and promptly get out yourselves along with it, I will proceed to kick you out and throw it out." And in the next place, in the war with the Filipinos, as in all other wars, fuel was added to the flame as soon as the war broke out. Among the Americans, charges soon came into general circulation and acceptance that the Filipinos had planned, but been frustrated in, a plot looking to a general massacre of all foreigners in Manila. This alleged plot was supposed to have been scheduled to be carried out on a certain night, shortly after February 15, 1899, among the Filipinos. On the other hand, counter-charges soon followed, and met with general credence. That the Americans made a practice of killing prisoners taken in battle, including the wounded. Neither charge was ever proven, but both served the purpose, at the psychologic moment, of possessing each side with the desire to kill, which is the business of war. Let us glance briefly at these recriminations. Between pages 1916 and 1917 of Senate Document 331, Part 204, may be found a photolithograph of the celebrated alleged order of the Filipino Revolutionary Government of February 15, 1899, to massacre all foreign residents of Manila. In his report for 1899-205, General Otis himself describes this order as one which for barbarous intent is unequaled in these modern times in civilized warfare, and speaks of it as issued by the Malolos government through the responsible officer who had raised and organized the hostile inhabitants within the city. After Aguinaldo was captured in 1901, according to an account given by General MacArthur to the Senate Committee in 1902, of a conversation with the insurgent leader, the latter was shown a copy of this document purporting to have been signed by General Luna, one of his generals. He disclaimed having in any way sanctioned it, in fact, disclaimed any prior knowledge of it whatsoever. 206. A disclaimer, which General MacArthur appears to have accepted as true, frankly and entirely. At page 1890 of the same volume, Captain J. R. M. Taylor, 14th U.S. Infantry, a gallant soldier and an accomplished scholar, who was in charge in 1901 of the captured insurgent records at Manila, states that he was informed that the document was originally signed by Sandico, then Secretary of the Interior of the Revolutionary Government. Captain Taylor made an attempt to run the matter down, but obtained no evidence convincing to him. A like investigation by General MacArthur in 1901 had a like result. 207. On the other hand, Major W.M. H. Bishop, of the 20th Kansas, was credited in a soldier's letter written home, which first came to light in this country, with killing unarmed prisoners during the advance on Caloocan. The charges originated with a private of that regiment. Major Bishop denied the charges. 208. An investigation followed, in the course of which somebody made an innuendo or charge. It is not important which, that other officers used their influence to prevent a full ventilation of the matter. Specifically, General Funston, then Colonel of the 20th Kansas, and Major Metcalf, of the same regiment. These last two also made a most vigorous general denial, and nothing whatever was established against them. The whole matter was finally disposed of by being forwarded to the War Department at Washington by General Otis on July 13, 1899, some 6 months after the occurrences alleged, with the remark that he, General Otis, doubted the wisdom of a court-martial of the soldiers who had made the charge against Major Bishop, as it would give the insurgent authorities a knowledge of what was taking place, and they would assert positively that our troops practiced inhumanities. Whether the charges could be proven or not, and that they would use the incident as an excuse to defend their own barbarities. 209. The last endorsement on the papers preceding General Otis's final endorsement was one by Colonel Crowder, now 1912, Judge Advocate General of the United States Army, in which he said, "I am not convinced from careful reading of this report that Private Brenner has made a false charge against Captain Bishop," adding that considerations of public policy sufficiently grave to silence every other demand require that no further action be taken in this case. 210. The considerations of public policy were of course those indicated in General Otis's final endorsement on the papers already quoted. They were compellingly controlling, in my judgment. Independently of the merits, washing one's soiled linen in public is never advisable, and placing a weapon in your enemy's hand in time of war is at least equally unwise. Some shreds of this once much mooted matter doubtless still linger in the public memory. It has been thus briefly ventilated here solely to trace the genesis of the bitterness of that war, and its numerous later barbarities avenged in time. The bitterness thus early begun grew as the war went on, until every time the hapless Filipino peasant soldier speaking only 2 or 3 words of Spanish would falsely explain, when captured, that he was a non-combatant, an amigo, friend. It usually at once filled the captor with vivid recollections of slain comrades, and of rumored or sometimes proven mutilation of their bodies after death, and these reflections would at once fill him with a yearning desire to blow the top of the amigo's head off, whether he yielded to the desire or not. Of no instance where he did so yield am I aware, but I do know that the invariable statement of all Filipinos unarmed and ununiformed when captured, to the effect that they were amigos, became, to the American soldier not remotely dissimilar to the waving of a red, ragged bull. Of course this was also due, largely, to the guerrilla practice of hiding guns when hard-pressed and actually plunging at once into some make-believe agricultural pursuit. As for Major Bishop, it is inconceivable to me that he gave any order to kill unarmed prisoners, even admitting for the sake of the argument that he is a fiend. He is not a fool. As a matter of fact, he was a brave soldier, as all the reports show, and is a reputable lawyer, having many warm friends whose opinion of any man would command respect anywhere. The truth of the whole matter probably is that just before going into battle, when our troops were in an ugly temper by reason of the rumors of barbarities alleged to have been perpetrated by the enemy, or contemplated by him, the word was passed along the line to take no more prisoners than we have to, and that thought originated with some irresponsible private soldier of the line inflamed by stories of mutilation of our dead or of maltreatment of our wounded. Such a word, so passed from man to man, can, in the heat of conflict, very soon evolve into something having for practical purposes all the force and effect of an order. Through the foregoing and like causes, including the water cure, later invented to persuade amigos to discover the whereabouts of hidden insurgent guns or give information as to the movements of the enemy. 211. Our war with the Filipinos became, before it was over, a rather dark and bloody affair, accentuated as it was, from time to time, by occasional Filipino success in surprising detachments from ambush, or by taking them unawares and off their guard in their quarters, and eliminating them, the most notable instance of the first being the crumpling of a large command of the 15th Infantry by General Juan Cales, in southern Luzon, and the most indelibly remembered and important example of the second being the massacre of the 9th Infantry people at Balonga, in Samar, in the fall of 1901. Certainly more than one American in that long drawn-out war did things unworthy of any civilized man, things he would have believed it impossible, before he went out there, ever to come to. Personally, I have heard, so far, as I now recollect, of comparatively few barbarities perpetrated by Filipinos on captured American soldiers. Barbarities on their side seem to have been reserved for those of their own race whom they found disloyal to the cause of their country. Personally, I have never seen the water cure administered, but I once went on a confidential mission by direction of General MacArthur, in the course of which I reported first, on arriving in the neighborhood of the contemplated destination, to a general officer of the regular army who is still such today. 212. That night the general was good enough to extend the usual courtesy of a cot to sleep on, in the headquarters building. toward dusk I went to dine with a certain lieutenant, also of the regular army, 213. As we approached the lieutenant's quarters, a sergeant came up with a prisoner and asked instructions as to what to do with him. The lieutenant said, "Take him out and find out what he knows. Do you understand, Sergeant?" The sergeant saluted, answered in the affirmative, and moved away with his prisoner. We went into the lieutenant's quarters, and while at dinner heard groans outside. I said, "What is that, Jones?" 214. Jones said, "That's the water cure he's giving that Albrecht." 215. Want to see it? I replied that I certainly did not, returning that night to the general's headquarters. After breakfast the next morning, I met my friend Jones coming out of the general's office. I said, "What's the matter? What are you doing here?" He having mentioned the evening before an expedition planned for tomorrow, he said, "Well, I just had a talk with the general to see if I could get my resignation from the army accepted." "Why?" said I. "Well," was the reply, "that designating the prisoner of the night before by a double-barreled epithet died on me last night. Just how the matter was hushed up I have never known, but Jones was never punished. More, the young general officer of the United States Army in the Philippines, during our war with the Filipinos, at least winked at the water cure as a means of getting information, and quite a number of subalterns made a custom of applying it for that purpose. It was practically the only way you could get them to betray their countrymen." Did I report the incident to General MacArthur? Certainly not. It was the business of the general commanding the district. The water cure, though very painful, was seldom fatal, and when not fatal was almost never permanently damaging, and it was about the only way to shake the loyalty of the average Filipino and make him give information as to hidden insurgent guns, guerrilla bands, etc. It was a part of benevolent assimilation. Let us now return to the early battlefields about Manila, which we left initially to analyze the extreme bitterness of the feelings between the combatants that very early began to develop. We left war correspondent John F. Bass among the dead and dying on one of these fields, supposedly musing on the white man's burden, or land grabbing, or trust for civilization theory, or whatever it was that moved the 57 senators whose votes had ratified the treaty by a majority of just one more than the constitutionally necessary 2/3. The reason the writer lays so much stress on M.R. Bass's letters to Harper's Weekly on the early fighting in the Philippines is because his remarks come direct from the battlefield, and are, as it were, res geste. They were no doubt for red opus, to use a Latin phrase, which in plain English means while the iron is hot. They reflect, more or less accurately, the feelings of the men whose deeds he was recording. He and O.K. Davis, now Washington correspondent of the New York Times, and John T. McCutcheon of Chicago, the now famous cartoonist, who was with Dewey in the Battle of Manila Bay, and Robert Collins, now London correspondent of the Associated Press, and Dick Little of the Chicago Tribune, a little man about 6'3", and lots of other good men and true, were all through that fighting, and we will later come to an issue of personal ferocity between them and General Otis, which culminated in the retirement from office of Secretary of War Alger, and ought to have resulted in the recall of General Otis, but did not, because to have acknowledged what a blunderer General Otis had been, and to have relieved him from command, as he should have been relieved, would have been to swap horses crossing a stream, as M.R. Lincoln used to put it, in declining to change generals during a given campaign. The object here is to bring out the truth of history as to how the men who bore the brunt of the early fighting felt about it, testimony as to what the officers and men of the army said would be of no value, because a complaining soldier's complaints are too often only a proof of cold feet. 216. These newspaper men, not under military orders, were daily risking their lives voluntarily, just to keep the American public informed, and the American public were kept in darkness and only vouchsafed bulletins giving them the progressive lists of their dead and wounded, and this last only on demand made upon Secretary Alger by the people of Minnesota, the Dakotas, etc. through their senators. The War Department did not want the people to know, did not want to admit itself how plucky, vigorous, and patriotic the resistance was. The period of the fighting done by the state volunteers from February until fall, when public opinion finally forced the administration to send General Otis an adequate force, is slurred by Secretary of War Root in his report for 1899. I do not mean that it was slurred intentionally, but the Philippines were a long way off, and M.R. Root and M.R. McKinley naturally relied for their information on their commanding general on the spot. There were gallant deeds done in the Philippines by those Western fellows of the state regiments which volunteered for the war with Spain that would have made the little fighting around Santiago look like, well, to borrow from Jimmy Fadden's fertile vocabulary, like 30 cents. But General Otis was not in a position to get the thrill of such things from his office window, so very few of them were given much prominence by him in his dispatches to the Adjutant General of the Army. This was wise enough from a political standpoint, seeing that a presidential campaign was to ensue in 1900 predicated on the proposition that American sovereignty was in accord with the wishes and aspirations of the great mass of the Filipinos, to use the words of the President's message to Congress of December 1899. Caloocan was taken by General MacArthur on February 10. The natural line of advance thereafter was of course up the railroad, because the insurgents held it and needed it as much as we would. Throughout February there were engagements too numerous to mention. The Navy also entertained the enemy whenever he came too near the shores of Manila Bay. One incident in particular is worthy of note, and worthy of the best traditions of the Navy. I refer to the conduct of Assistant Engineer Emery Winship off Malabon, March 4, 1899. Malabon is 5 miles north of Manila, on the bay, not far from Caloocan. On the day named, a landing party of 125 men from the U.S.S. Bennington went ashore near Malabon to make photographs, in aid of Navy gunnery, of certain entrenchments and buildings that had been struck by shells from the Monadnock. They foolishly failed to throw out scouts ahead of their column, and were suddenly greeted with a withering fire from a whole regiment of insurgents who had seen them first and lain in wait for them. They retired with considerably more haste than they had gone forth. The insurgents advanced, firing at double quick toward the comparative handful of Americans, and would undoubtedly have killed the last man jack of them. But Engineer Winship, who had been left in charge of the tug that brought the landing party shoreward to keep up steam, saw the situation and promptly met it. He unlimbered a 37mm Hotchkiss revolving machine gun which stood in the bow of the tug, and opened up with accurate aim on the advancing regiment of Filipinos. Naturally he at once became a more important target than the retreating body. Nevertheless, he kept pumping lead into that long howling murderous advancing brown line until, when within 200 yards of where the tug lay, the line recoiled and retreated, and the landing party got safely back to the ship. It was literally a case of saving the lives of more than 100 men by fearless promptness and dogged tenacity in the intelligent and skillful performance of duty. The awnings of the tug were torn in shreds by the enemy's rain of bullets, and her woodwork was much peppered. Winship was hit 5 times, and still carries the bullets in his body, having been retired on account of disability resulting therefrom, after being promoted in recognition of his work. Soon after March 25, General MacArthur, commanding the 2nd Division of the 8th Army Corps, advanced from Caloocan of the railroad to Malolos, the insurgent capital, some 20 miles away. Malolos was taken March 31st. Our February killed were 6 officers and 71 enlisted men, total 77, and a total of 378 wounded. By the end of March the list swelled to 12 officers and 127 enlisted men killed, total 139, and a total of 881 wounded, making our total casualties, as reported April 1, 1020, also 15% of the command, or about 2,500, were on sick report on that date from heat prostrations and the like. 217, for these and other reasons, farther advance up the railroad was halted for a while. Meantime, General Lawton, with a staff consisting of Colonel Edwards, Major Starr, and Captains King and Sewell, the Big Four they were called, had come out from New York City by way of the Suez Canal. bringing most welcome reinforcements, the 4th and 17th Infantry. These people arrived between the 10th and the 22nd of March. What happened? Soon after, as a result of their arrival, must now become for a brief moment a part of the panorama. The lay of the land General Lawton first swept over being first indicated. Luzon is practically dictated, east and west, by the Pasig River, and a lake out of which it flows almost due west into Manila Bay, Manila being at the mouth of the river. Under the Spaniards, all Luzon north of the Pasig had been one military district and all Luzon south of the Pasig another. The 8th Army Corps always spoke of northern Luzon as the North Line, and of southern Luzon as the South Line. The lake above mentioned is called the Laguneta Bay. It is nearly as big as Manila Bay, which last is called 20-odd miles wide by 30 long. On the map, the Laguneta Bay roughly resembles a half moon, the man in which looks north, the western horn being near Manila, and the eastern near the Pacific coast of Luzon. General Otis had learned that at a place called Santa Cruz, toward the eastern end of the Laguneta Bay, there were a lot of steam launches and a Spanish gunboat, which, if captured, would prove invaluable for river fighting and transportation of supplies along the Rio Grande de Pampanga and the other streams that water the Great Central Plain through which the railroad ran and which would have to be occupied later. So as soon as possible after General Lawton arrived and the necessary men could be spared, he was sent with 1,500 troops to seize and bring back the boats in question. Of course the country he should overrun would have to be overrun again, because there were not troops enough to spare to garrison and hold it. But for the present, the launches would help. This expedition was successful, leaving the head of the lake nearest Manila on April 9, and returning April 17. It met with some good hard fighting on the way, sweeping everything before it of course, inflicting considerable loss and suffering. General Lawton's report mentions, among other officers whose conspicuous gallantry and efficiency in action attracted his attention, Colonel Clarence R. Edwards, now chief of the Bureau of Insular Affairs of the War Department, of whose conduct in the capture of Santa Cruz on the morning of April 10, he says, no line of battle could have been more courageously or intelligently led. 218. The resistance was pretty real to Colonel Edwards then. Even the assimilation was quite strenuous, and it continued to be so until his great commander was shot to the West in the forefront of battle in the hour of victory in December thereafter, and the colonel came home with the general's body. Since then the colonel has sold no more, but has remained on duty at Washington, the birthplace of the original theory that the Filipinos welcome on Rome, charged with the duty of ruling over the erring Filipino who thinks he can govern himself but is mistaken, and also with the still more difficult task of trying to live up to the original theory as far as circumstances will permit. As a matter of fact, the Filipinos would probably have gotten along much better than the Cubans agreeing, had General Lawton do their what he and General Wood were said to work doing in Cuba. Shortly after Santiago fell, public opinion is a very dangerous thing to trifle with. And when, in September 1899, there was a story going the rounds of the American newspapers that Lawton, the hero of El Caney, the man who had reflected more glory on American arms in striking the shackles of Spain from Cuba than any other one soldier in the army, had called the war in the Philippines this accursed war, the War Department got busy over the cable to General Otis and obtained from him a denial that General Lawton had made such a remark. But the public knew it's Lawton and what he had done in Cuba, and had a suspicion there might be some truth in the rumor. So, the War Department cabled out saying newspapers say Lawton's denial insufficient, and then repeating the words attributed to him. So,
I shouldn't be doing this like this. I just could have done it with 2 clicks. Alright, so delete. 1 click. 2 clicks. maybe 35%. I need to get ready for bed, but it's been fun. So, thank you for tuning in and clicking the like and subscribe. And we'll get together as soon as we can. Till then,